So, we've all heard the story, right? Like the ultimate historical bedtime story.
Oh, absolutely. The classic fable.
Yeah, a uniquely evil, basically cartoonish tyrant sitting on a gold-plated throne.
Demanding to be worshipped as a living god.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And casually ordering the deaths of infants while, laughing maniacally.
Right, Pharaoh. The quintessential villain of good versus evil that we've been passing down for millennia.
But what if we've been reading it completely fundamentally wrong?
Which is exactly what we are exploring today. Because what if Pharaoh isn't a historical personality at all?
Right.
What if this text isn't profiling a single wicked man, but rather, and this is wild, diagramming a mathematically precise, self-sustaining system of power?
I mean, that premise alone completely shatters how we look at history.
It really does.
And that's what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We're looking at a lecture from the Tolu Islam archive. Specifically, it's an analysis of the opening verses, Ayat 1 through 6 of Surah Al-Qasas from the Quran.
Yeah, and our mission today is to look at this source material not as a piece of theology.
Right, not a pious fable.
Exactly. We are looking at it as a hyper-advanced manual on civilizational survival, power dynamics, and systems engineering. We are looking at what the source calls the Pharaoh algorithm.
The Pharaoh algorithm, I love that term, because the lecture argues that if you strip away all the religious sentimentality,
All that mythological aura we've projected onto the text.
yeah, if you strip that away, what you are left with is a purely rational socioeconomic blueprint.
A sociological blueprint that outlines the load-bearing pillars of oppression, how they function to subjugate millions, and most crucially, the built-in sociological certainty of how those systems eventually collapse.
So in this reading, Pharaoh is just a variable.
Exactly. Just a placeholder.
Yeah.
Pharaoh is the name for any apex entity that runs this specific algorithm of control.
And for you, listening right now, by the end of this deep dive, you're going to have a completely new lens, like a diagnostic tool.
A way to analyze modern empires, multinational corporations.
Tech monopolies, political structures, all of it. How they build massive power and how they inadvertently, but inevitably, engineer their own destruction.
But to understand how this works, we really have to start where the text starts. And we have to do it by completely discarding the mystical approach.
Right. Because the source text begins by analyzing the very first verse, which is literally just 3 Arabic letters. Ta, sin, mim. Yeah. And historically, the conventional reading treats these as unbreakable magical codes, right?
Oh, totally. Like a secret language where the believer simply bows their head and says, only the divine knows what this means.
Which, I gotta be honest, always felt like a massive cop-out to me.
It really does.
Like, if you were opening a manual on human society, why start with a riddle that humans aren't supposed to understand?
Well, the analyst in our source material agrees entirely. He argues that an actionable universal law cannot begin with a mystical dead end.
Yeah.
It just logically doesn't make sense.
Right.
Instead, he applies a really rigorous linguistic methodology. He traces these letters back to their functional Arabic roots to understand what parameters are being set for the sociological law that follows.
So he looks at the phonetic and lexical origins. Let's break those down.
Yeah, so Tab points to the root concept of tawil, which denotes vastness, comprehensive reach, or like a long extending shadow.
Okay, vastness.
Then sin connects to Sami, which is the function of hearing, absorbing information, or possessing this all-encompassing awareness.
Got it.
And finally, Meme derives from Halim, which means forbearing, deeply patient, and operating on a delayed timeline rather than, seeking immediate reaction.
Wait, let me make sure I'm putting this together correctly. So if we combine those derived meanings, vastness, absolute awareness, and profound patience,
Right.
it sounds like the text is defining the environment, or like the nature of the rule set we are about to enter.
That's exactly it.
It's essentially saying the sociological principle about to be described is universal in its reach. It accounts for all human variables, and it operates on a macro-historical timeline.
Yes. It's not a law that executes in a week. It's a law that might take 3 generations to complete its cycle.
Wow. Okay, that is a perfect synthesis of the source's argument. It establishes this really clinical environment.
And immediately after setting these parameters, the next verse describes the book, meaning the compilation of these laws, as mubin, which means clear, manifest, and unambiguous.
And I found the lecturer's point on this specific word, mubin, to be one of the most brilliant insights in the entire archive.
Oh, it's so good.
He notes that a functional protective law must be crystal clear. Because when a law is ambiguous, when it relies on vague terminology or subjective interpretation.
The people who benefit are never the marginalized.
Exactly. The beneficiaries of ambiguity are always the oppressors.
I mean, just consider how modern legal systems function today. Ambiguity in tax law, or environmental regulations, or corporate liability. That is the playground of the powerful.
Right. If a law is murky, the entity with the most expensive lawyers, the most resources, the most stamina, they will find the loophole and exploit it.
Every single time. Therefore, a universal law meant to diagnose and dismantle tyranny cannot afford to be mysterious.
It has to be mubin, clear.
Exactly. The text is declaring its own nature. The socioeconomic principles we are about to diagram are observable, empirical facts of human history. There are no loopholes in the math.
Which brings us to the execution of that math. How exactly does a tiny elite manage to subjugate a massive population without just, going bankrupt, paying an army?
This is where we get to verse 4. It outlines the specific governance technology.
The Pharaoh algorithm.
Right. It states, Pharaoh exalted himself in the land and split its people into factions, oppressing a group of them. The Arabic phrases here, Alak fi al-ard and Jalam al-Ashiyan, that is the code running the algorithm.
Okay, let's unpack that. Allah fi al-ard.
So that is the overstepping of boundaries, the monopolization of state power and resources. It is the absolute centralization of authority.
But centralized authority alone is incredibly fragile.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the basic mathematics of tyranny. The ruling class, the elites at the apex of the pyramid, they are always a statistical rounding error compared to the general population.
Yeah, they're like the 1%.
It is mathematically impossible for them to outnumber the masses.
And you can't just rely on brute force. Bullets are expensive. Soldiers need salaries and food and housing and pensions.
Exactly.
If you try to control 99% of a population purely through physical violence, the cost of your security apparatus will eventually exceed the gross domestic product of your entire empire.
You'll literally bankrupt yourself just trying to keep people in line.
So you need a cheaper, more efficient mechanism.
You run the Pharaoh algorithm.
Yep.
You divide the massive, overwhelming population into managed factions. That is the precise functional meaning of the word shayan.
I was thinking about this like a software engineer looking at a server architecture.
Oh, I like this. Go on.
Well, if you have a central operating system, that's the oppressor, and it has limited processing bandwidth, how does it keep the millions of individual background program, the oppressed population, from realizing they outnumber the core processor?
Right. If they all ping the server at once, it crashes.
Exactly. How do you keep them from pooling their resources and crashing the entire system? You sandbox them. You put them in separate, isolated virtual environments.
Oh, that's brilliant.
You feed them conflicting protocols so they are constantly pinging and interfering with each other rather than sending their requests to the central server.
The modern parallel there is just chillingly accurate. Because the source emphasizes that Xi'an does not mean people who simply happen to have organic disagreements.
Right. It's not just natural political debate.
No, it means engineered factions. It is the deliberate, calculated fragmentation of a society. You elect one faction on Tuesday, give them a few minor privileges, maybe a slightly better tax rate, or even just a purely symbolic title.
And then you suppress another faction.
Right. Then, on Thursday, you flip the dynamic. You manufacture horizontal conflict. As long as the factions are looking sideways at each other with suspicion and jealousy and hostility,
they are fundamentally incapable of looking up at the architect of their misery.
Precisely.
I mean, think about how our own social media feeds and political districts are engineered today, right? For you, the listener. You are placed into an algorithmic sandbox, fed curated content that makes you absolutely furious at another demographic of everyday people who are struggling just like you.
Yeah, it ensures you spend all your energy battling your neighbor over cultural grievances.
Guaranteeing you never combine forces to look up at the multinational entities extracting both of your data and wealth. It is the exact same math.
And within that engineered fragmentation, the system requires a specific output. The text says Pharaoh oppressed a group of them, rendering them weak.
Rendering them weak, okay.
The Arabic term used is istadafa, and the people are called the mustadafin. And the source text draws a massive, heavy line under this word to correct a huge historical mistranslation.
Because usually when we read translations of these ancient texts, Mustadafin is just lazily translated as the poor or the meek, right?
Right. It treats poverty as this static, almost romanticized category, like it's just a natural phenomenon, like the weather.
Yeah, like some people are just naturally poor and we should feel bad for them, maybe give them some charity.
Exactly. But the linguistic root of istadafa utterly rejects that passive framing. It is an active transitive process. It implies a structural rendering.
So they aren't naturally weak?
No. They do not lack intelligence or capability. They have been rendered weak by systemic design. Their poverty, their lack of political agency, their generational trauma, none of this is a moral failing or a natural accident. It is the calculated, required output of the system.
Because a machine needs fuel.
Exactly. The system requires a drained battery to power its own expansion. The weakness of the Mustadafin is the product the Pharaoh algorithm manufactures.
Okay, but this raises a massive logistical question for me.
Let's hear it.
Let's say you have the military might, that's Pharaoh, and you have the economic monopoly, which the source identifies later as the archetype of Korun or Korah.
Right. Korun represents the hoarding of capital and the control of the means of production.
So you've got the guns and you've got the money, but eventually people are going to starve. The pressure of that structural weakening is going to build up, right?
It has to.
A mother who cannot feed her child isn't going to care about Pharaoh's army. She's going to riot. You can't shoot everyone, and you can't buy off everyone. There has to be a missing piece keeping this powder keg from exploding.
And you have just deduced the necessity of the third load-bearing pillar in the triad of power.
The triad of power.
Right. So Pharaoh is the political and military autocracy. Korun is the extractive capitalist monopoly. But the system relies entirely on the third archetype, Hema. Haman represents the ideological manipulation, the religious priesthood, the architects of the societal narrative.
The ideological pacifier.
Exactly. Because physical force and economic starvation will eventually trigger a survival response. To prevent that, you need psychological submission.
You need the battery to willingly, enthusiastically plug itself into the machine that is draining it.
That is a perfect way to put it. Haman's specific function in this algorithm is to take the gross systemic exploitation engineered by Pharaoh and Korun and rebrand it as the natural immutable order of the universe.
Or, in the language of the time, God's will.
Yes, God's will.
This is where the analysis genuinely terrified me, honestly, because of how effective it is.
It's incredibly insidious.
The priesthood, or today, the PR firms, the institutional media, the legacy think tanks, they preach passivity. They look at the structurally weakened, the Mustadafin, and they say, your poverty, your suffering, that is a divine test of your character.
And Pharaoh's immense, unfathomable wealth.
Yeah.
That is God's blessing upon him.
Right. You shouldn't covet what he has. You should be content with your lot. God, in his infinite wisdom, has distributed the wealth exactly as he sees fit.
It weaponizes contentment. It takes the very valid, rational anger of an exploited class and neutralizes it by making it a moral failing.
Because if you rebel against the economic system, if you demand fair wages or political representation, you aren't just a political dissident anymore.
You are a heretic.
Exactly. You are rebelling against the universe itself. You're ungrateful for the test you've been given. Any revolutionary thought is reframed as a sin. The priest tells the starving man to pray for patience in the next life, rather than demanding his stolen wages in this one.
The source material actually refers to this as an ideological anesthetic.
Anesthetic, wow.
Yeah. If Pharaoh wants to perform the surgery of wealth extraction, he needs the patient to lie still. Haman provides the anesthesia. The priesthood, or the ideological apparatus, is the cheapest and most effective security force the system has.
Because they don't guard the palace doors?
No. They police the minds of the oppressed. They make the prison invisible.
That reframing totally changes how we have to read the rest of the verse. Ayat 4 ends by saying Pharaoh was slaughtering their sons and letting their women live.
Yes, the infamous slaughter.
Now, the traditional literal translation is that he was physically murdering every male newborn of the Israelites. But the analyst points out a massive, glaring logical flaw in that literal reading from a socioeconomic perspective.
It completely violates the premise of an extractive economy.
Right.
I mean, if Pharaoh is running a massive continent-spanning empire that relies explicitly on the slave labor of the Israelites to build the infrastructure, to work the agricultural fields, to drive the GDP, why on earth would he systematically exterminate his entire future labor force?
It makes absolutely no sense. If you kill every male child, within one generation, your economy grinds to a total halt. You have no workers. The empire collapses.
Right. It makes zero sense for a systems engineer to destroy their own machinery. So the source redefines the terms linguistically, moving away from the mythological slaughter and looking at the functional Arabic root of Yudhebihu.
Okay, what does the root actually mean?
Well, the root of Yudhebihu encompasses much more than literal physical slaughter. In classical Arabic usage, it means to cut down, to render impotent, to destroy the courage, the intellect, or the essence of something.
Okay.
You can slaughter an animal, yes, but you can also slaughter a nation's potential.
So the system slaughters the sons by systematically destroying their masculinity, their courage, their ability to stand up and organize, breaks their spirit through endless, grueling labor, economic anxiety, and Haman's ideological pacification. It renders them cowards.
And letting the women live, especially in the context of the deeply patriarchal, warrior-centric culture of the ancient Near East. That meant reducing the men to a state of complete societal passivity.
So the text is describing a process of psychological emasculation.
Yes. The system doesn't want dead babies. Dead babies can't harvest wheat or build monuments.
Jesus, that's dark, but yeah.
The system wants docile, broken, physically capable laborers who have absolutely no fight left in them. It wants a population of biological males who have been psychologically neutralized, so they behave like non-combatants.
So stripping away the mythology reveals this cold, calculating machine. Divide the population, extract their wealth, break their spirit, pacify their minds with ideology.
That's extremely thorough.
So it looks like a perfectly closed loop of eternal dominance. But, and here's where the text executes a massive pivot in verses 5 and 6, the source argues it is not a closed loop. The engine of reason steps in to outline the fatal flaw in the code.
Right. The structural law, inside these next verses, states that a system built on the permanent, engineered suppression of a faction is mathematically and sociologically unstable.
Unstable, okay.
Verse 5 reads, "And we desire to show favor unto those who were rendered weak in the land, and to make them leaders, and to make them the inheritors."
See, the conventional Sunday school reading views this as a deus ex machina, like a divine miracle where God simply looks down, feels bad for the underdog, and randomly decides to intervene and rescue them.
Which treats the oppressed as a moral footnote.
Exactly. But the expert analysis in our source frames this entirely differently. The structurally weakened group is not a charity case. They are the latent successors.
The rational principle being announced here is an empirical law of sociology. The source refers to it as the law of requital, or mukafati amal.
Mukafati amal.
Yes. It is the concept that every action has an inevitable corresponding reaction. Not just in Newtonian physics, but in human sociology.
But how is this a mathematical certainty? I mean, we've seen empires, the Romans, the British, various dynasties last for centuries. How does oppression guarantee its own collapse?
Because of what extreme systemic pressure actually does to a human collective over time. When you concentrate power by fracturing a people and you squeeze them into the margins, you inadvertently manufacture the exact conditions required to forge the coalition that will inherit what you built.
Okay, I see.
Yes, the pressure breaks individuals, it crushes many, but for the collective, it concentrates grievance. It creates a shared, undeniable trauma that strips away petty differences.
It's like compressing carbon to make a diamond.
Exactly.
Oppression forces the marginalized to develop incredible resilience. If the state apparatus refuses to protect you, you are forced to protect each other. You develop mutual aid networks, you build underground economies.
Right. You develop an absolute, unbreakable solidarity because your literal survival depends on it.
And furthermore, you concentrate competence. The elites at the top become soft, relying on the system to maintain their status.
While the oppressed have to work twice as hard, think twice as fast, and endure 10 times the pain just to survive a single day.
So the act of oppression generates its own ultimate correction. The oppressor looks at the managed factions and thinks they are operating a stable, docile herd.
In reality, they are operating a sociological pressure cooker, and they have bolted the lid shut while constantly turning up the heat.
Which makes verse 6 so profound. The text says that Pharaoh, Haman, and their forces were made to see from those very people the thing they were guarding against.
The threat to the empire doesn't come from a foreign invading army crossing the border.
Right. The destruction of the system is an inside job. It is the system completing the circuit that its own injustice set running.
It is a built-in algorithmic feedback loop. The destruction of the Pharaoh archetype isn't an arbitrary lightning bolt thrown from the sky because God was angry.
No.
It is the inevitable mathematical sociological consequence of his own governance technology. The act of dividing and ruling actively seeds the successor state.
I want to highlight the specific functional language used here too, because the text says the mustadafin, the structurally weakened, will be made amima, meaning those at the front, the leaders.
And where thin, the inheritors of the system.
Notice how transactional and systemic those words are. Leadership and inheritance in this framework are transferable functions. They are not permanent titles granted to a divine pet.
Right. The universe, according to the sociological law, does not care about your royal bloodline, your corporate charter, or your historical prestige. It only cares about the algorithm.
Wow.
If you run the algorithm of oppression, you will eventually, inevitably, transfer your accumulated power and infrastructure to the very people you oppressed.
But there has to be a catalyst, doesn't there? Because a pressurized tank just explodes. A riot is just an explosion of pure, unguided anger.
And historically, riots usually just end up burning down the marginalized community's own infrastructure while the elites watch from a safe distance.
Exactly. The system doesn't just automatically flip overnight into a utopia.
You are entirely correct, and the source addresses this. The expert analysis brings in a concept articulated by the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. The blood of Israel eventually boils.
The blood eventually boils.
There is a breaking point where the ideological pacifiers, the himans, the institutional media, completely lose their efficacy. The visceral pain of the physical and economic extraction finally overrides the ideological anesthesia. People wake up during the surgery.
But again, if the factions are so deeply fragmented, if they have been engineered for generations to hate each other, how do they suddenly coordinate? How do they turn a boiling pot into an engine?
They need a socio-political engineer to unengineer the factions. In this text, that is the Moses archetype.
The Moses archetype, okay.
And I use the word archetype deliberately. The source does not present Moses as a wizard with a magic staff doing parlor tricks to impress a king.
Right, no magic.
Moses is presented as a visionary leader who steps into the pressure cooker, understands the exact mechanics of the Pharaoh algorithm, and works systematically to combine the factions.
He has to take the fragmented, suspicious, traumatized groups and unify them into a single organized force, an ummah, or a cohesive party, driven by an undeniable, self-evident truth, which the text refers to as haq.
Because the distinction between a riot and a revolution is the nature of the grievance. The visionary catalyzes constructive grievance.
Constructive grievance?
They don't just hand the oppressed a torch and tell them to burn the palace. They channel the concentrated white-hot grievance of the Mustadsin into a highly disciplined movement.
Because the ultimate goal is not merely the destruction of the oppressive system, which the text calls batil, that which is false or transient.
Right. The goal is the immediate replacement of it with a constructive, equitable system.
Now, this is where the source material gets incredibly bold, and I want to make a clear pivot for you, the listener.
Yes, let's talk about the simulation.
Right, because the lecture we are analyzing doesn't just leave this as an abstract theory of ancient history. It takes this entire framework, the Pharaoh algorithm, the triad of power, the engineered factions, the catalyst, and layers it directly over a massive 20th century geopolitical event.
The struggle in the Indian subcontinent that culminated in the end of the British Raj and the creation of Pakistan in 1947.
And as your guides today through this material, I want to be explicitly clear, we are not taking sides here.
Definitely not. Our goal here is not to litigate 20th century history, endorse specific political narratives, or take sides in the incredibly complex legacy of the subcontinent's partition.
Exactly. We are impartially exploring how the author of this source text utilizes a historical event as a modern case study in systems theory. We are looking at how the math of Surah Al-Qasas is theorized to map onto modern geopolitics.
We are just tracing the variables.
So how does the source map the ancient triad onto the reality of the British subcontinent?
The mapping is remarkably precise, according to the text logic. The British Empire is cast in the role of the autocratic center, the pharaoh. They held the absolute political and military monopoly over the subcontinent.
They had the armies, the courts, the state apparatus.
Exactly. Then the role of Qarun, the economic monopoly, is assigned to the dominant capitalists of the era, both British colonial extractors and the local elite classes who controlled the industry, the banking sector, and the agricultural monopolies.
They ensured the wealth flowed upward and out of the region.
Right.
Okay, so you have the military occupation and the economic extraction. But what about Haman, who serves as the ideological pacifier in this 1947 simulation?
The source assigns the critical role of Haman to a specific class of nationalist clerics and traditional religious leaders of that era.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. These were figures who preached passive integration. They told the massive Muslim population to accept the status quo, to blend into a composite nationalism under British oversight or majority rule, and specifically not to assert a distinct independent political identity.
So they utilized theological arguments to encourage patience, effectively providing the ideological justification for the population remaining a managed, subjugated faction.
Exactly.
So following the algorithm, the post-1857 Muslim population of the subcontinent is identified as the Musadafin. After the failed uprising of 1857, they were systematically suppressed.
Politically fragmented into various regional, linguistic, and sectarian groups, actively engineered to distrust one another.
And ideologically confused by the competing narratives of the clerics telling them to just, keep their heads down.
They were the drained battery.
Yeah.
And the British Empire, perhaps more than any other entity in modern history, was the undisputed master of the divide and rule algorithm.
Oh, absolutely.
They ran the Xi'an mechanism flawlessly for decades, elevating certain princely states, suppressing others, creating separate electorates that pitted communities against each other.
Ensuring the population remains structurally weak and horizontally focused.
Right. But then the algorithm demands a catalyst. The modern visionary has to emerge to unify the factions. The source presents a dual figure for the modern Moses archetype, the philosopher-poet Muhammad Iqbal and the political strategist Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
Let's break down the rules. Iqbal provides the theoretical framework, right?
Yes. He acts as the diagnostic engine.
Yeah.
He looked at the socio-political landscape and realized that the prevailing concept of territorial nationalism, the very thing the clerics were preaching, was actually an ideological trap.
A trap.
There's a pacifier designed to keep the Mustadafin permanently fragmented as a permanent minority in any future democratic setup. He argued forcefully that their survival required an identity based on ideological unity and a shared socioeconomic vision, not just shared geography.
And then Jinnah steps in to execute the socio-political engineering.
Right.
And what I find absolutely fascinating about Jinnah's role in this specific case study is the stark asymmetry of the conflict. I mean, Jinnah is facing down the British Empire, a global superpower that had just won World War II, and a highly organized, massively funded domestic political opposition.
And he has absolutely no military.
The source leans into this heavily. Jinnah didn't command tanks. He didn't have battalions of soldiers in the streets. He was armed almost exclusively with a typewriter, razor-sharp constitutional arguments, an unyielding willpower, and a unifying truth.
He is the ultimate realization of the socio-political engineer combining the factions. Jinnah took groups that were deeply divided by language, geography, and class, and built an absolute, undeniable solidarity.
He turned a fragmented, weakened demographic into an organized, unified force.
And the source concludes this extensive case study by showing how the specific predictive law of verses 5 and 6 executed in reality. In August of 1947, the structurally weakened faction achieved total sovereignty.
They inherited a massive new state apparatus. They broke the economic monopoly. And crucially, looking at the overarching history, they did it without a traditional, kinetic, state-on-state war.
They didn't defeat the British Army on a battlefield.
No. The system of colonial rule collapsed under the weight of its own sociological inevitability, accelerated and directed by the organized solidarity of the Mustadafin.
It serves as a modern proof of concept for the ancient algorithm. The oppressor, the colonial empire, was made to see, from the very demographic they were managing and pacifying, the exact outcome they had spent a century guarding against: the creation of a sovereign, independent state out of a suppressed faction. The mechanism completed its cycle.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this deep dive. The core lesson encoded in these 6 verses is the perpetual interplay between permanence and change in human history.
The permanent, unbreakable principle is that divide and rule governance always, mathematically, seeds its own succession. Any social, economic, or political order that survives primarily by splitting, managing, and weakening a faction of its population is actively writing its own expiration date. The act of concentrating oppression is simultaneously the act of concentrating the competence and solidarity of the future inheritors.
That is the permanent law. What changes is merely the costume the actors wear.
Right, the props on the stage shift.
In the ancient world, it's the Nile, the chariots, and the gold-plated throne. In the 20th century, it is the British Empire, the viceroys, and colonial resource extraction.
And today?
Today, it might be the architecture of a modern nation-state, the labyrinth of a global supply chain, or the algorithmic manipulation of a $1 trillion tech monopoly. The core algorithm reappears in every single era, just wearing different clothes.
Which means Surah Al-Qasas does not open with a historical fable about a dead king. It opens with the schematic for a sociological mechanism. And it tells us with absolute clarity in advance exactly how that mechanism ends every single time it is run.
So we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to take away and apply to the world around you.
Look at the landscape today.
Look at the massive global supply chains that dictate how we live. Look at the tech monopolies that control our data and our discourse. Look at the political superpowers dominating the geopolitical stage. Where do you see the Pharaoh algorithm running right now?
Who is actively engineering factions, forcing us into algorithmic sandboxes to fight each other so they can maintain their power.
And, infinitely more importantly, where are they inadvertently concentrating the grievance, the resilience, and the solidarity that will eventually rise up and replace them?
Because the algorithm is always running in the background of human civilization. The only question we have to answer is which part of the cycle we are currently living in.